Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about the wire EDM enhancements that have been made for this particular milestone. There are three big things that I'll introduce to you. One being the ESPRIT system for Azure 1.2.3. These are the older Azure machines. We now support them with the .xml databases. The next would be the addition of those XML databases directly from the Wire EDM ESPRIT system. And finally, I'll talk about the introduction of the Wire EDM ESPRIT system to the manual cycles for all of the machine types that use the EDM ESPRIT system and the XML databases. First, we'll talk about the EDM ESPRIT system for Azure. So it's now available, as I mentioned, for the old Azure, the 1.2.3 machines. These machines were last manufactured in the mid-1990s, but they're extremely durable, and the field requested that we continue to provide support for them. So things such as T, the power register, S, the feed rate register, and the offsets are typically included in the database. And as I mentioned, all cycles, including manual EDMing, is now supported. Next, the addition of Wire EDM databases. So some of you are aware that the Wire EDM databases, of course, are XML files. And you can use a XML reader or some kind of text editor to be able to edit those. However, we also have offered the option of a separate editor, which actually looks a lot like the ESPRIT system, but you had to launch it separately from the prog directory. Well, again, in direct response to a field request, it is now possible to actually edit these Wire EDM databases directly from the ESPRIT system. So if you think back to the legacy databases, when we used to use Access databases, we used to be able to actually edit those databases directly from ESPRIT. And now we can do the same thing here in ESPRIT TNG. In order to be able to edit the XML databases directly in the ESPRIT system, you need to first enable this in the options. It's under Options, Machining, and Enable Database Editing. You set that to yes. And then once you enable that, you'll see that you have some additional options in the interface. So you'll be able to see that we have these edit options next to the wire and workpiece data. You also have the option to add more fields to the wire and workpiece data. And then, of course, next to the cut strategy grid. And then down at the bottom, you'll see that we have that save and save as. And then finally, what we'll talk about today is the Wire EDM ESPRIT system for manual cycle. And we'll switch to ESPRIT in just a minute, and I'll show you all three of these new enhancements. But prior to this, all of our cycles enabled the Wire EDM ESPRIT system with the exception of the manual cycle. So the workflow is very similar to using the Wire EDM ESPRIT system for any of the other operation types. Basically, simply you enter the wire and workpiece data. You then, the cut strategy is then selected by the ESPRIT system, and the startup or the initial and rough data are going to be used by the manual cycle. So you'll see in this particular example, I'm using Mitsubishi, and both the startup or the initial and the rough data are being transferred from the ESPRIT system to your grid on your manual EDM cycle. Now that we're in ESPRIT, I'll show you how the Azure 1.2.3 database works. So the first thing I'll do is, you see I have a part that's already been imported, and I also have created my feature and my feature group on it. So I'm almost ready to program. However, first I want to specify which database I'm going to use and make sure that I'm using the proper machine. You can see here that the machine type is set to Azure, not Azure Vision, Azure, because again, these are going to be the old 100, 200, and 300 series machines that we're supporting here. And I want to point to a particular database. This is an example that will be provided to you, so you can see how these databases can be set up for the Azure 1.2.3 machines. I'll go ahead and validate, and I'll validate again. Go back to the part view. I will then select my feature group, so my parent feature here to create my operation. We'll go to the EDM ribbon, and we'll choose 2-axis contouring. Again, the default all of my settings to the previously used. So you can see everything is in the light blue. I'm going to name my operation 2-axis contour. And what I'm really interested in is here on the Cut Data tab. We'll go ahead and launch the new EDM EXPRIT for Azure 123 machines. And you can see it's looking at the database that I specified in the machine setup. And we have some parameters here, so you can see you have your wire and workpiece data. Inside the database, I can again use the exact terminology for these Azure 123 machines so that people who are familiar with the machines and with the terminology will be a little bit more familiar with ESPRIT and using ESPRIT. You can see I can change my roughness setting. I don't have too much in this database as it's just an example, but I can change my roughness setting and I'll get different cut strategy data here in my grid. Let's go ahead and choose the H roughness, which gives me a rough and 4 skims. You can see my data is here. And once I validate and click OK, you can see it's then read into my grid here. So my primary cut settings grid. I'm going to accept all the other settings as they are and click OK. And I just wait for my operations to get created for my Azure 123. Okay, so again, that was created and that was developed because of direct request from the field. Some of our resellers were saying, hey, we see a lot of these older Azure machines out there and they're very durable. They've been around for a long time and we expect them to continue working. So we want to be able to continue supporting them. And that's why we've added the functionality for EXPRIT system for Azure 123. So the next thing we'll talk about is the actual addition of wire EDM databases from the EXPRIT system, or I should say directly from the EXPRIT system. This was functionality that was included, again, directly as a request directly from the field. They said, hey, you know, back in your legacy access databases, you allowed us to edit them. Why don't you allow us to directly edit them directly from the EDM EXPRIT system? So we enabled that. And remember, first we're going to have to go to the options and turn it on. By default, it's actually off. So you probably saw in the previous example when we were showing off the Azure 123 database that I didn't have those icons for the addition. So we're going to go and turn those on. And I'm going to just use the same file here. So we'll go to File, Options, it's under Machining, and you can see Enable Database Editing, and we'll switch that on. This is a system setting, so once it's on, it will remain on from document to document. And let's go back and edit, say, the parent operation under die 4. Just picking die 4 as an example. You can actually select any of them. And we'll relaunch the database. And you can see now I have these icons. Not only do I have the icons, but I can actually switch these text fields above. So for example, the file source I can change. Maybe in this particular case, I'm going to change the file version to 1.1. Okay, so you can change that directly here under Series Technology. Then under Workpiece and Wire Data, I can then add or edit the items that are available to me under each of these fields. And then, of course, I can also add new sub items as well. So you can actually have additional fields that you add. In this particular example, let's add or edit to the actual roughness. Remember, right now I only have 2 roughness settings. So we'll go ahead and change that. Notice I can also change the header key here. Let's click on this Add New List Item, and I'm going to then rename this and call it perhaps A equals, I believe it's 0.1, and we'll then go ahead and what I can actually then do is actually move this up or down the list. So I can prioritize the list and click OK. Now, if I were to switch this to the roughness setting, of course, I don't have any data that are associated with this wire and workpiece data, which makes sense. So next, what I would like to do is perhaps create some additional columns on my grid, or I should actually say create some additional rows on my grid. So I'll go ahead and click on Add Row. Here we can enter both the key and the caption. In this case, it's going to be the same. Call them both rough, for example. Makes sense because this is my first pass. I can then click OK, and then I can come in here and edit these values. So typically the T and the S registers are 1 for your rough, and then we can enter our offset. And in this particular case, let's enter 0.125, something like that. I can then repeat this to add additional rows. So I can create skim 1, skim 2, skim 3. Oops, excuse me, skim 1. You can see I can then, for example, if, oh, you know what, I don't want skim 1, I can delete that. So you have the full power of the EDM Database edition inside the ESPRIT system. You'll also notice that we have a couple of icons down here at the bottom. We have both Save and Save As. Save will overwrite the database that you currently have. So if you were to click on Save, it will give you a warning. It'll say, okay, it's going to overwrite this particular file and give you the path. Are you sure you want to do it? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. I'd rather do a Save As. This will allow me then to change the file name. Perhaps I will put a underscore version 1.1 and click OK. And that will then save my database, and I can then use that database either on this file or in future files. Can then click OK to validate. You see that reads in the new cut settings. So I have only a rough. You can see my new offset of 0.125. And I can then validate out of the technology page. And you can see it then updates my cut so that I only have my rough setting, or my rough cut here. So pretty handy that we can now enable the addition of databases directly from the ESPRIT system. And remember, we have to enable that through the options. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about the Wire EDM ESPRIT system for the manual cycle. So our resellers were saying, hey, you have the EDM ESPRIT system for all of your cycles, all of your technology, 2-axis contouring, 4-axis pocketing, etc., except for the manual EDM cycle. And it would be useful to know what power settings, what feed rates I should use, and I would like to be able to get those out of the database. So we then developed this functionality, and the workflow is exactly the same as what we saw with the 2-axis contour when we used the Wire EDM ESPRIT system. Matter of fact, I'm going to use the same file here. So we'll first launch the manual cycle, and I'll default all to just basically get rid of any of my settings that may have been sticking around from the last time I used the manual cycle. And we'll launch the Wire EDM ESPRIT system. I'm going to keep the settings here the same. I want actually more than one cut because I want to show you how how the rough data gets transferred from the EDM ESPRIT system into my primary cut setting grid here on the technology page. As I may have mentioned in the previously, if the database, this particular database, does not have startup or initial conditions, but if the database did have that, it would actually read both the startup or initial conditions into the manual cycle along with the rough settings. So notice here that I have my rough settings. I have T is equal to 1, S is 1, and an offset is 0.175. I'll simply click OK. See that information gets read into my manual cycle. And then I now can use the power and my feed rates and my offsets if necessary with my manual cycle. So previously you may have had to open up maybe the database separately and done a surge, or maybe had to look through, maybe you have a hard copy of your technology settings you needed to use. But now we can actually use these, use the ESPRIT system to easily get those cutting conditions directly from our XML databases, just like we can with all the other Wire EDM technology. So that pretty much wraps up everything for today. We have 3 big things that we introduced for Wire EDM in this particular milestone. As always, we look forward to your feedback. If you have any questions, please let us know. Have a nice day.